Well, to discuss more than just the weather between these two countries, we're going to bring in Steve Gill, former USTR official. Thanks for joining me, Steve.
Hey, Scotty.
Okay, so let's talk about this climate change, obviously very important. And that's what the preface of this conversation that is happening between the United States and China. But do you think they're going to go anywhere considering all of the outside factors? Or is climate change being used as a negotiating tool by both countries?
I think it is being used as a negotiating tool by both. You've got the Biden administration that is now going to change the temperature of the climate change argument by making it climate crisis instead of climate change. They're going to change the wording to try and up the ante. On the other hand, you've got the Chinese that pollute a lot more than we do, and yet some of the pollution accords, some of the climate change stuff that's being put into place won't affect the Chinese. It'll just hamper U.S. business. So the Chinese are happy to accept whatever the Biden administration wants to do in terms of ramping up climate change arguments, because it just makes them more competitive in a world environment and hampers us.
Well, and that's the thought right now. But there's also so many other things going on. We've seen past meetings not go so well between the Biden administration and the Chinese government. So do you think the Chinese actually are taking John Kerry or any other United States envoy serious right now, considering the last 3 months and how the interactions have gone?
The short answer would be no. They're not taking anything seriously with the Biden administration. Now, you know, I'll be critical of the Biden administration when I think they deserve it, but I'll be supportive when I think they deserve it. And I'll say that sending a delegation to Taiwan to make it clear that we are not going to back off of our support of Taiwan with this sort of aggressive military posture that the Chinese are showing the world, I think that is a great point with the Biden administration to do, to show we're not backing away from Taiwan. We've seen what happened in Hong Kong, where the Chinese have not followed through with their promises, have clamped down on Hong Kong and freedoms there. And I am proud that the Biden administration is showing they will not back away from Taiwan and are sending a strong message to China on that front. However, we also know that the Chinese have been backing away from the trade deal we negotiated. They are not sticking to their promises with respect to intellectual property, for example. They are continuing to fight the tariffs we have in place. We have a situation where American business people can't travel to China with business visas right now, and yet we're continuing to allow them to come here and do business. So the Biden administration needs to tough up on some fronts, but at least they're showing support for Taiwan, and hopefully we'll start speaking more for freedom and a return to normalcy in Hong Kong.
But let's talk about that, Steve. It's about the Biden support. Is it one thing to say, you know what, we think that you need to, obviously Taiwan needs to be free, it needs to remain independent, but is it another to actually put military force or to promise to have some sort of support beside it? And do you think the Biden administration would actually go that far and get involved, especially considering right now that how reliant the U.S. is on China in so many different levels?
Well, it's a mutual situation, right, where both countries are reliant upon the other in terms of economics and trade. You're going to see a lot of tough talk, and where it blurs the line is if you start crossing into actual military action. You know, we've seen the Chinese flying closer and closer to Taiwan, showing some military threats to Taiwan. And again, the U.S. has to make it clear that we already have agreements in place with Taiwan, that we will get militarily engaged if Chinese, you know, cross that bright line. Now, whether they or whether Putin or whether Kim Jong-un or any of the others in the world really believe that the Biden administration will be as tough as they talk, I think remains to be seen. They are all, as we've talked before, testing him. We're seeing it with Iran. We're seeing it certainly with Putin in Ukraine. We're seeing it with the Chinese threatening Taiwan. And Kim Jong-un isn't backing off from continuing to show that he's still a bad boy with Donald Trump out of the White House. So a lot of tests are going on, and we'll see if President Biden passes or fails. And I think it is a pass-fail test. I don't think we're looking at a grade here.
And that's the scary part, because I don't want to see what happens when Biden fails. Well, that probably does not mean good for anybody. That being said, let's go back to climate change on this, because that's what the preface of this meeting is. Why do you think China should actually agree to deal on climate change with anything when you look at their economy? And they do have a lot of regulations, but unfortunately those regulations aren't about necessarily the worker or the climate. Why do you think it should be in their best interest to even go into any sort of an agreement with the U.S. or any other country that would be involved?
I think it's because it will be a one-sided agreement. The Chinese win. I mean, the climate restrictions that will be put in place if we return to some of these climate change agreements impose burdens on the United States that don't apply to India or China or some of the other biggest polluters in the world. So it's clearly in the best interest of China to impose more restrictions on us to help themselves and their economy at the expense of the American consumer, at the expense of American industry. So they've got every reason to ramp this back up because it's a win-win for them and a lose-lose for us.
And that's exactly what I think is going to happen on this guide. Sure, they'll go into it all talk. All it does is put more regulation on us, and we've obviously seen in the past, even with the Paris Trade Agreement, they never necessarily abided by it. Steve, once again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Scotty. We'll talk again.